We start a little bit later, but the panel here before was also late, so we think you had enough time to chat over coffee now, so please be seated. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the breakout session on cybersecurity challenges. I'm Niklas Schörnig, and I'm with the Peace Research Institute in Frankfurt. And amongst other things, I'm organizing the consortium's e-learning. So, however, today we are talking about cybersecurity. And when it comes to the issue, you might have heard that just a few weeks ago, malware infected the state of Berlin's highest court, the Berliner Kammergericht, virtually preventing any use of computers and servers for weeks. And the court had to fall back to typewriters and fax machines. If you're so young not to know what a fax machine is, there are many people here around who can explain that. This week, Gießen University, the second biggest university in the German state of Hesse, had to be taken off the internet because of a continuing cyber attack, and it is unclear when normal IT operations can resume. And I was told it's more a matter of weeks rather than days. While in the first case, most experts agree that the court was just collateral damage, the attack against the university is seen as a planned and purposeful operation. Both incidents, however, show not only that the cyberspace has become a very dangerous place, we knew that already, but we have to ask ourselves whether those instances are already shadows of cyber war, as many German newspapers claimed. Maybe we should be more careful when using the word. So, what kind of cyber incidents and cyber operations are actually a threat to international security, which could legitimize self-defense according to Article 51 of the UN Charter? This leads to other questions. Can existing international law be applied to cyber conflicts? What about attribution? What are cyber weapons actually, and can we apply legally binding concepts of arms control to the new domain of cyber? We have heard some thoughts on this issue this morning and had a rather engaged debate. Maybe we can continue here as well. Of course, another question is what role can the EU play in all this? And is AI, or how is AI relevant in all this? Is it making things better or even worse? So you see, this is a vast array of difficult questions, and I'm more than happy that the organizers of this conference brought together such a distinct group of experts here to help shedding light on some of those issues at least. First, we will hear from Giacomo Persi Paoli. Giacomo is the program, he's on my right here. Giacomo is the program lead for security and technology at UNIDIR, with an emphasis on the implications of emerging technologies for security and defense, and he used to be an officer in the Italian Navy. Giacomo will offer a first overview from the perspective of the UN. Afterwards, we will hear Jinghua, and she is a visiting scholar in the Cyber Policy Initiative at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, and she's also a former military officer retiring from the Chinese People's Liberation Army in the rank of colonel. She will focus on the increase of offensive cyber operation and what threats these really pose to national and international security. After her, we will hear Gregor Ramuš, and he's working for the Osce in Vienna, where he's responsible for projects aimed at the reducing the risk of conflicts stemming from the use of information communication technologies and awareness raising. Gregor will debate how to react to new threats, whether confidence building is possible in cyberspace, and why and how it should be done. Last but not least, Raluca Csernatoni is a visiting researcher at Carnegie Europe and also a guest professor at the Free University of Brussels. Her recent focus has been the impact of emerging dual-use technologies, such as drones, on the EU security. But as many scholars starting with robotics, she has also moved to the field of AI. And she will broaden our perspective by addressing the issue of artificial intelligence and what kinds of problems we face in this closely related realm. So this is the outline, and I'm happy to give the floor to Giacomo now.
Thank you, Niklas, for the introduction, and thank you also to the organizers for giving me the opportunity to be here today to discuss cyber and international security, which is quite a broad topic. We'll do our best in the next hour and a half to address some of the issues, and definitely competing with a side event on space is not easy for anyone, but if there is one topic that can withstand space, it's probably cyber. So, cyber threats to international security. I think one of the things that I want to do in the next 10 minutes is really set the scene for the other speakers to then go into much more detail, but one of the main issues is that there is no single universally accepted definition of A, what is cyber, B, what is a threat. If I was to go around the room here today and ask each one of you, please define cyber, I would probably come up with, several dozens of different definitions. Cyber is a global challenge in nature, but threat assessments vary significantly by regions, sub-regions, and in some circumstances, even at the national level. So when I'm thinking about cyber threats, I try to consider it as a multifaceted problem, where priority are assigned differently based on national or regional threat perceptions and threat assessments. Some countries may prioritize cyber threat at a more strategic level, so cyber threats to strategic stability. Others may be more concerned in relation to cyber threats to, for example, critical infrastructure or provision of critical services. Others may consider new opportunities given by digital technologies for foreign interference in national affairs, for example, as a primary source of concern. And last but not least, cybercrime and cyber terrorism. Again, depending on who you're asking, they might be the primary worry. So in summary, digital technologies combined with an increasingly digital society have enabled over the course of the recent years new ways of achieving national, regional, or international destabilization. So it is important in this context that when we assess cyber threats to international security, we do not focus only on threats to infrastructure, military or civilian, or services, but we also consider potential weaponization of content, of data, of information. And again, these are perspectives that are regularly brought to the table in multilateral discussions. And here I'm not talking about the fake news term that is being overused in previous years. I'm really referring about malicious information operations, which are clearly not something new. Information operations have been happening for a very long time. But because of the technological development, can now be conducted at unprecedented speed and scale and can achieve strategic effect. So within this broad context, I find it difficult to answer in any definitive way the question of what is a cyber weapon. And that's because, in the context of disarmament and arms control, weapon is, the term weapon is a word of art, so to speak. While talking about, if you try to apply the concept of weapon to cyber, what I personally would feel unequivocally okay in labeling as weapon would be, a piece of malicious code, weaponized code, that when deployed can result in a kinetic effect that is somehow comparable to what you could achieve through a physical attack. However, this is just the tip of the iceberg, and I'm grateful that other speakers after me will kind of give you a broader perspective of where the threat landscape is evolving. But this tip of the iceberg is probably not the most common or extensive use of cyber capabilities today, particularly in peacetime. For example, does the technological capability to interfere with national or regional affairs, for example, through elections or other, fit the definition of weapon? Well, probably not from a semantic perspective, but if we think about the effect that this sort of activities may achieve, then possibly yes. Now, if we go into the context of the UN and multilateral discussions, in the past two decades, issues pertaining developments in information and communication technologies and related threats to international security have been on the table of UN member states. Well, as we speak, in New York, there is the 6th group of governmental experts on cyber. This is the 6th iteration, starting from 2004 to 2005. And there have been roughly every 2 years, there has been an iteration of this group of governmental experts with varying degrees of success, but still it's an ongoing process that shows for how long the UN has been thinking about this and working on these issues. And since this year, 2019, the first open-ended working group on the same topics, which means, very happy to elaborate on the technicalities, but the big difference is about participation and openness of the process. While there still are several open issues to discuss, there have been significant steps forwards over the last 15, 16 years as part of these multinational discussions. And this is particularly true following the successful 2015 group of governmental experts that produced a report, which was later in the year adopted, if you want, or unanimously by the UN General Assembly with Resolution 70237, which states that member states should be guided by that report in their use of information and communication technologies. So what does that mean in practice? First of all, one of the big concerns that we've heard also this morning, does international law apply to cyber? Yes, states have agreed that international law, including in particular the UN Charter, is applicable to cyber, and so are obligations to respect and protect human rights and fundamental freedoms. Legal principles noted in the 2015 report, including humanity, necessity, proportionality, and distinction, and their relevance to protecting civilians, also apply. However, it's not about the what, it's about the how. Questions about how international law applies, remain today one of the topics that member states are still discussing in this multilateral fora. However, what I would like to stress here is that cyber cannot only be analyzed in the context of armed conflicts. Digital technologies are becoming increasingly pervasive in today's society, and there is the need to establish common principles and standards of behavior in cyberspace during peacetime. And that's where the norms and principles of responsible state behavior in cyberspace that are included in the 2015 GGE report come into play. And in addition to those, we see kind of the, in a good way, the proliferation of these norm development processes and norm entrepreneurs, not only led by states, but also led by private sector, by wider technology communities. If we go back to those that have been adopted by the General Assembly, these are 13, carefully crafted norms that indicate the do's and the do-nots, or the should and should nots, and they cover a wide range of issues which are critical for ensuring a secure and free cyberspace during peacetime. From supply chain security to responsible vulnerability disclosure, protection of critical infrastructure, and so on and so forth. But again, as many consensus-based outputs, they cover the what, not necessarily the how. And how to operationalize these norms and principles is an area where states cannot and probably should not work alone. They should work with other international and regional organizations, private sector, and civil society to ensure that all relevant stakeholders are constructively involved in the process of building tools and practices that can operationalize these high-level principles. And this is true not only for norms, but also for other key elements that are included in the report, such as confidence-building measures, and we'll hear more about it later, international cooperation, capacity building, and this is really where regional organizations like the EU, but also the OSCE, can make a meaningful impact, and they're making it already. So, some concluding remarks. The period 2019-2021 will be an important period for cyber at the international and multilateral level, with both the group of governmental experts and the open-ended working group happening and working in parallel. Now, both processes are consensus-based, which means that any substantive report will have to be approved by consensus. Now, in this context, I'm inviting you to read both previous and future reports with a critical eye. And what I mean by that is that sometimes what is not included in one of these reports is more revealing than what it is. Because things that are omitted from reports often indicate areas and issues where it was not possible to achieve consensus, and therefore areas that are still requiring further work and debate. If you see that something that you would consider obvious, missing, it's probably not because nobody thought about it, but it's probably because it had to be sacrificed on the altar of consensus building. So on this note, I would like to end my remarks and give you back the floor.
Thank you very much. Now the stage is set. I think maybe you could switch for the mic.
Also, I have a slide.
Federica? Yeah. There are slides. Who can start these slides?
How do we switch them?
Yeah. So, yes.
There it is.
So,
Figure it out.
thank you. It's working, thank you.
I can see over there.
Yeah, so. No remote control. We're the first panel, I guess, to use the.
First one. Okay, I can begin things.
So, Liu, the floor is yours.
Thank you. First of all, I'd like to take a chance to thank the organizers for having me here and having this wonderful event. So today, I will talk a bit about the offensive cyber operations. We know that the words like cyber war or cyber 9/11 has appeared in newspapers almost every day, but sorry, the slide is not there. But if we look back in the past decade, we only can name a few of them as really offensive cyber operations with significant consequences. However, what we can see right now, actually in 2019 alone, there are at least 4 offensive cyber operations conducted by the United States. I will just name them since we cannot see it from there. The first is there are 2 against Russia. One is against one trial firm called Russia's Internet Research Agency because it was involved in meddling in U.S. midterm elections, and another is against Russia's electronic power grid to warn Russia against further aggressions in U.S. critical infrastructure. And the other 2 are against Iran. One is against Iran's intelligence group because it will help to plan for attacks on foreign oil tankers. And the other is against the computers used by Iran to control its rocket and missile system. So I will talk a little bit about when the U.S. is trying to use these offensive cyber operations to solve the security concerns, whether it has solved the trouble or it has caused more trouble than the trouble has been saved. There is not only the increase of number of offensive cyber operations, but also there are, it's over there. And also there are changes of the U.S. cyber policies from several areas, like the change of strategic concept, the operational concept, and also a presidential directive that are easing the restrictions on the approval process for the offensive cyber attacks is not on. And also we can see, who can help me to the next slide, please? No one?
I think they're working on it as I see it, but I'm sorry, I'm not sure. So.
Okay, I will continue.
You have to continue.
Yeah, but also there are some proclamations and interviews from very high-level officials to show that the cyber policies have changed, been different from the previous ones adopted by the previous administration. And of course, such a big change has already aroused a big, intense debate in the academic society about next slide, please. Thank you. Yes. And all the debates that are embracing such a big change can be summarized into three groups. Like they think that cyber defense can send more clearer signals of deterrence, can be more effective due to the specific feature of cyberspace, and also is more accessible because it's more humanitarian. Next slide, please. Well, all these arguments make sense to a certain degree, but if we are to embrace such a big change, we have to think more thoroughly. Thank you very much. Think more thoroughly and think in the longer term. So the first is when we are using cyber offense as a deterrent, other capabilities and intentions are really credible. I'm using the cyber attack against IRA as an example. A very quick question is, if it is to show the deterrence, why it's against IRA, which is affiliated with Kremlin, but not GRU, which is directly responsible for meddling in the elections. And some professor at West Point have made three main points of the reasons. But it's very interesting to look at them because the reason A and reason B are actually talking about the capabilities of deterrence, cyber deterrence, and reason B and reason C are talking about the willingness of the use of cyber force. However, if we look at the reasons clearly, thoroughly, then it makes us draw to the conclusion that the US is not resolute or capable enough to use cyber force against core targets when necessary, especially against a powerful state. I'm not working on it, why it's changing. And the second is when we are using cyber offense as a preemptive action, are the effects, is there cyber attack here? Yeah. I will continue from here, maybe. Then we can, of course, there are, let me have a try. No, it's not working. No. Yeah, I think it's controlling from somewhere else. Could you turn back 2 slides, please?
Just say when you need it. He's over there, so the guy. You should just guide him.
Okay, I will wave when I need it.
Yeah.
Okay. So, of course, the attackers enjoy the advantage over defenders for many reasons. But when we think of it as a preemption, what we have to think, what are the effects? Another place. Yeah. So the first conclusion I can get is most effects of cyber attacks we can see from till today are very temporary. If we look at Stuxnet as an example, the assumption when Stuxnet just took place was that a new nuclear device could not be deployed no earlier than 2015, 5 years after the Stuxnet. However, the real data from IAEA has given us a very different picture. And John Lindsay has made the conclusion that Stuxnet, at the best, can only produce a very temporary slowdown in the occurrence of the capability rather than a slowdown of the capability itself. So please, yes, thank you. And the second conclusion is most effects are not leading to political changes. the research has shown, another research has shown the 4% of all the documented cyber operations that have led to even just temporary political concession, and more importantly, most effects are unverifiable till today. If we take the attacks on Iran's rocket and missile system example, there is no clear clue whether that has been successful or not. The only way to know whether Iran's rocket missile system can still work is there is a large-scale conflict, and we can see whether the Iran can still launch their missiles, and that not happened, so we don't know whether the effects are really as successful as US claimed or not successful as Iran claimed. So the third point about cyberspace offense as tit for tat. If we think it is a very humanitarian way to retaliate, then we have to ask the first question about where is the threshold. Whenever we know if we have the right to start the cyber offense, then we can ask the question whether it is humanitarian enough. And of course, we know there is no clear rules regarding where is the threshold, which means when to use cyber force, what targets, and what the consequences that you are looking at. Again, please. Yeah, and what's worse, it can lead to miscalculations of the intentions, because we all know that the intentions of cyber attacks are very unclear. Still, the cyber attacks on Iran, what's the intention? Is it just to punish Iran for its past actions, or is trying to disable Iran from a further aggression? Or maybe it's just creating a new window for further kinetic military operation. So if we look at the DoD cyber strategy, which has listed 5 objectives of cyber operations, only number 2 suit the situation, which means a large-scale military operation will follow the cyber attack. And the only reason, I think, in my assumption, I think it's rational why Iran didn't make such a decision, or why Iran didn't retaliate. The only reason is the huge imbalance of military strength between Iran and the United States. So Iran chose to swallow the business, wait and see what will happen next, because the signal is not so clear enough, and maybe be preemptive in the next phase whenever there is a new signal to show a large-scale military operation is following. So it actually is leading to a very possible scenario of escalation of crisis that is unintentional. And most importantly, what precedents have been set by all this use of offensive operations. We know that U.S. is the most capable cyber power in the world, and all the steps it has been taking are being closely watched and followed by other countries. If we still take Stuxnet as an example, right after Stuxnet was released, the proliferation of cyber means in the Middle East happened overnight. And it has caused the proliferation in a way that we haven't expected. And now if the use of cyber offense become a new customary, what's the world we will be in at that time? And I think I will stop here because I have used up the time, but I was trying to talk about the principles, but I think next panelists here will talk some of them, so I will be very quick. There we can think of some principles of the responsible use of cyber power, like where are the boundaries we can think of, and also what are the situation or the context that we can think of using cyber offense, and also what are the targets that should be off the limits, and also if there are decisions to use cyber offensive capabilities, what kind of after-use damage control we can do in advance to try to limit the damage. So I will stop here. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your presentation, especially under those circumstances. Thank you very much. But having seen now what kind of threats we face, what can we do about it? Gregor, please.
Thank you very much. I think it's quite fitting that we have IT problems in the cyber panel, which helps us portray the practical attack surface. I also have a presentation, so we'll see if it works. I guess I'll just raise my hand when we want to move on. So first of all, my name is Gregor Ramuš. I'm from the Transnational Threats Department of the OSCE in Vienna. And today I'll be talking about the role of OSCE confidence building measures in addressing cyber ICT security challenges. I'll start by giving a quick overview of what the OSCE is, what we do, what our approach to security is, and then move on to cyber specifically and focus on the confidence building measures. So the OSCE traces its origins to the early 1970s, when it started as an important multilateral forum for dialogue and negotiation between the East and the West during the Cold War. The Helsinki Final Act from 1975 established a mechanism which later became the OSCE. It is the largest regional security organization with 57 participating states in North America, Europe, and Asia, reaching people from Vancouver to Vladivostok. It works for the security of more than 1 billion people through political dialogue and practical work. The OSCE's concept of security covers 3 dimensions: the political military, the economic and environmental, and the human dimension. The OSCE approaches any security-related issue in a comprehensive cross-dimensional way. For example, we approach challenges that pose a threat across borders, such as climate change, terrorism, cybersecurity, by promoting stronger ties and cooperation between states, creating partnerships between the private and public sectors, and engaging civil society. This is especially important when you talk about cybersecurity, because cybersecurity cannot be encompassed in one of those dimensions solely, and is rather cross-dimensional in nature. The OSCE functions on the basis of political consensus, which means that there can be no objection from any of the 57 participating states. Whilst this means that sometimes the political discussion is longer and reaching a decision may be harder, once a decision is reached, all 57 participating states stand behind it. This also ensures that all 57 participating states are equally represented. A key objective of our security-related efforts is to create greater openness, transparency, and cooperation between states, which is also reflected in the cyber ICT security CBMs. So let's move on to cybersecurity. In recent years, we have seen an increase in sophisticated incidents related to high-profile targets, like attacks on critical infrastructure, or theft of personal data, or even election tampering. Cyber attacks are not just limited to lone wolves and criminal groups. Many experts connect the scope and sophistication of cyber attacks to actions backed by states. States are developing cyber capabilities for potential use in peacetime, whereas previously deployed only in conflicts. More than 50 states have confirmed cyber programs that give militaries an active role. 10 out of the 15 biggest military spenders possess or are developing offensive cyber capabilities. If we now move on to the global approach to cybersecurity, the UN continues to play a central role in exploring how greater cyber stability can be achieved on an international level. No other platform can produce overreaching recommendations on matters on international law, norms, confidence, and capacity building. The 2015 UN Group of Governmental Experts consensus report sets out a 4-pillar approach to addressing existing and arising threats from the use of ICTs by states through exploring how international law can apply to cyber operations, developing norms, rules, and principles of responsible behavior by states, developing confidence-building measures, and enforcing capacity building and training. It's important to see how these 4 elements are interconnected. So, for example, norms need to be socialized through CBMs to ensure further backing by states. CBMs can serve as a practical mechanism and as a platform for discussion, even in crisis situations. And if states don't necessarily have the capacity to engage in these cyber stability mechanism, focus needs to be on building up their national capacities so that they can become an active contributor and increase their international engagement efforts. So how does the OSCE approach cybersecurity? The OSCE has started to work on cyber ICT security issues in 2012 when the open-ended informal working group was established with the goal to develop confidence-building measures to reduce the risks stemming from the use of ICTs. CBMs do not make it to the front page of newspapers, but they receive considerable attention among diplomats because they serve as a means of engagement between states during periods of low-level trust. CBMs are non-binding, voluntary measures, but all 57 OSCE states made a political commitment to adhere to them. The OSCE participating states adopted 2 comprehensive sets of confidence-building measures, the first in 2013 and the second in 2016. The main objective of CBMs is to enhance interstate cooperation, transparency, predictability, and stability, as well as to reduce the risks of misperception, escalation, and conflict that may stem from the use of ICTs by states. The 16 voluntary CBMs can be broadly categorized into 3 clusters. The first one is posturing, CBMs which allow states to read another state's posture. An example of this is CBM 7, information exchanges on national organizations, strategies, policies, and programs. The second one is focused on communication, CBMs which offer opportunities for timely communication and cooperation, including in times of crisis. An example of this would be CBM 8, nominating the national political and technical point of contact. And the last one being preparedness, CBMs which promote national readiness for cyber incidents. An example of this one would be CBM 15, activities to enhance protection of ICT-enabled critical infrastructure. The OSCE currently places special emphasis on implementing the already agreed upon CBMs. So here are a few examples of our practical work. In terms of trust building and communication, we have been strengthening the work of the CBM 8 point of contact. CBM 8 is among the most implemented measure, with 95% of participating states nominating at least one policy and optionally technical point of contact. The Transnational Threats Department currently turns this network into a community by organizing annual meetings of the point of contacts, facilitating bilateral exchanges, and organizing numerous and tailored communication checks. In terms of capacity building and awareness raising, the OSCE has launched a project in 2016 that identifies and prioritizes national CBM implementation challenges. Within this project, the OSCE facilitates creating national implementation roadmaps and customized but capacity building assistance plans. And one more project I would like to mention is from 2017, the Transnational Threats Department has been organized sub-regional trainings on the role of ICTs in the context of regional and international securities. CBMs are often discussed as a regional mechanism for reducing tensions, but geographically and politically tight-knit groups of states are likeliest to cooperate in an event of a cyber incident. This is why TNTD is providing policymakers, technical officers, and other relevant actors with trainings on sub-regional levels so that they can raise awareness of each other's perceptions, capacities, and available platforms for cooperation. So we talk a lot about CBMs, but why does this matter? Why should you think about regional organizations when we talk about cybersecurity? First of all, as you have seen, our experience in confidence building measures, capacity building, and other related efforts are noteworthy. We have adopted 16 confidence building measures, trained over 100 national policymakers, organized 6 sub-regional trainings since 2017, have over 100 national cyber points of contact, and meet at least 3 times a year. In 2019, the informal working group met 4 times. Moreover, regional organizations like the OSCE serve as a platform to discuss new ideas and practical efforts that may lead to adoption of new international law and norms. At the same time, they can serve as an implementer of globally accepted agreements like the GGE reports. It's regional organizations such as the OSCE, the ASEAN Regional Forum, and the EU that are developing practical measures that turn UN recommendations into a reality. All EU member states are also participating states of the OSCE and continue to play a huge role in the development of OSCE CBMs by actively participating in the implementation process. Moreover, regional organizations play an important role in informing the UN process by providing feedback on the practical implementation of their recommendations. The new mandate of the UNGGE foresees consultation with regional organizations, confirming the increasing role of regional organizations in global discussion on the stability of cyberspace. The consultations with the OSCE already took place in June 2019. So I'd like to conclude with 4 main takeaways from this. The scope of CBMs may be narrow, but they do provide a crucial component to the reduction of risks of conflict stemming from the use of ICTs by giving diplomats and policymakers the opportunity to look for common solutions, even in times of low trust or crisis. We believe that implementing the CBMs is key for greater cyber stability. They address less contentious issues between states, contributing to the establishment of mechanisms that ultimately create a certain routine among states, which may lead to more ambitious goals. The OSCE has participated in both the open-ended working group of the UN and in the informal consultations of the GGE, and we are happy to see that CBMs remain on the agenda as one of the key tools of the global cyber stability efforts. And lastly, OSCE CBMs are focused on promoting communication, building trust, and making cyberspace a little bit more predictable and therefore a little bit more safe. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Gregor. I see we perfected now the presentation. However, now we don't have a third one, right? No. So, Raluca, the floor is yours, talking about AI.
Yes. Thank you very much, and good afternoon. I will go analog and try to improvise. No, I'm actually joking in this regard, but I have been given, in a way, the difficult task of talking about artificial intelligence, and claiming expertise in this new domain is for sure clearly daunting, especially for someone that comes from more a social science background. But I will give it a try and will do my best to address some issues regarding artificial intelligence, the current buzzwords, hypes, and I heard in the previous panel another interesting expression, FOMO, the fear of missing out in what means a potential arms race in artificial intelligence, and why national governments and superpowers or powers are now focusing on this new challenging domain. I think that I'm again focusing on artificial intelligence in this panel more, let's say, on a broader perspective, because yes, AI may be applied in the cyber domain to enhance certain functionalities, but as I understand, artificial intelligence is much more broader in terms of technology and its applications in defense or security and defense. And in this regard, I would define artificial intelligence more as an enabler and as a general purpose technology, as well as a dual-use technology that can be understood and applied in varied fields and domains, including the military and defense dimension. And of course, the cyber security, cyber defense dimension plays a very important role in this regard. And my colleagues did a great job covering the cyber dimensions in terms of threats and potential ways to mitigate them. However, what I find quite interesting and as a researcher and quite problematic at the same time is the fact that artificial intelligence is more and more likened to former other disruptive, let's say, military technologies such as nuclear and used in this weaponized narrative in terms of enhancing certain capabilities. And I think that this narrative and this framing is highly problematic because it contributes to a self-fulfilling prophecy in the sense of engendering the arms race and placing artificial intelligence in a very securitized national security context. And from this point of view, of course, it would be naive to think that the arms race is not already well underway. In terms of the AI's potential applications in various military areas. However, efforts should be made, or more efforts should be made to, let's say, shift the narrative and focus on more the beneficial and positive dimensions of artificial intelligence in a broader sense. So from this point of view, of course, yes, international preventive governance mechanisms need to be put in place to actually address the potential disruptive dimension of artificial intelligence and its applications in civil military areas. However, yes, in this regard, we need norm entrepreneurs. We need indeed international consensus and acceptance about what are the red lines where artificial intelligence has to be applied or is not to be applied. And we know again about the discussions in the UN about lethal autonomous weapon systems and their development, and this is just one area of application of artificial intelligence. Others are related to command and control, more the dull and dirty applications of logistics, for that matter. So the potential of AI in defense in general is quite broad and huge. Then another dimension regarding potential international preventing governments mechanisms, regulation, and putting forward rules and guidelines. I would refer to this as a social control, the social control of technology dilemma. And this was put forward by a researcher. It's called the Collingridge dilemma. Apologies for the pronunciation of the name. But this is quite an interesting dilemma because we see that this technology is now evolving. We don't see clear results yet. It's still in a process of evolution. And now the dilemma is, how do you regulate something that is constantly evolving? We have an information problem in this regard. Until we see the wide use of this technology in a certain domain, such as defense or other domains, then how can we keep pace with this fast-pacedness and evolution, and how do we control it based on, let's say, certain ethical values, standards, and norms. And of course, here we might take a precautionary approach and think about the potential destructive applications and the negative consequences of this technology. We can look at specific areas that emphasize and prioritize human rights when it comes to this technology. Because as compared to previous technological revolutions in the past, artificial intelligence has the potential to revolutionize even warfare and security making. Now we see again other buzzwords circulated around. We are moving from network-centric warfare, cyber warfare, to algorithmic-driven warfare, forever warfare. All this type of buzzwords and let's say labels are actually pointing to something quite fundamental that we need to pay further attention to, meaning is there actually a paradigmatic shift in war making and warfare that is engendered by artificial intelligence? And in what areas is this fundamental change? Of course, we already have discussions about exactly what is the human control of these technologies. If we delegate decision-making and agency to machines or algorithms in terms of high-risk situations such as warfare and the battlefield. And here, of course, prioritizing the human in the loop in the decision-making process, as well as prioritizing international law, humanitarian law, is one way to go about. Now, I think that I'm also in this panel to speak a little bit more about the European Union's approach in terms of artificial intelligence and already the norm entrepreneurship happening at the EU level, especially at the European Commission, in terms of putting forward ethical guidelines for the development of trustworthy artificial intelligence. And mind you, this debate is not geared towards defense per se, but it's a broader approach. And from this point of view, looking at AI from this trustworthy angle, human-centric angle, and prioritizing laws, norms, and the humans, or human agency and human rights, is one way to go about, as well as, on the other hand, developing robust technologies and technologies that are trustworthy, because at this point, as I mentioned before, AI is still evolving. There are biases, glitches, technological glitches, and trusting the technology at this point, I think it's premature. So I don't want to take too much of the time. I'm not sure how I'm doing with it. But overall, and to end on a more positive note, I think that the best place to start is now or yesterday in discussing preventive governance mechanisms and the red lines where this technology should be applied in terms of security and defense, and weapons development and weapon systems development. And for sure, fora, international and regional fora, will play an important role in establishing these red lines. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, and thank you for broadening our perspective and reminding us that cyber is only one part of this whole change of warfare we are actually seeing right now. I have many questions which I would like to address to the panel. However, I restrict myself to give you more time to debate now, because I was told we cannot talk for until 5:15, but only 5 to 5:10. So directly to you, please identify yourself and keep yourself to questions rather than co-presentations. Maaike, please.
Maaike Verbrugge from the Vrije Universiteit Brussels. I had a question, because like listening to these presentations, it seemed that most of the efforts are more about protecting states than about protecting the people. And a lot of the efforts of the effects of AI and cyber are about, are also our states, imposing them on us. So what can the international community do about this? Obviously, the case of China and the Uyghurs is a famous example, but I mean, it's far from limited to China. So can the international community do anything about this? I mean, it's a state issue, or what would you recommend on this?
We will collect as in the other panels. So the next is, and I hope I can pronounce it right, Serene van der Meer.
Thank you. That's me, Sico van der Meer, research fellow at the Klingendaal Institute in the Netherlands. Thank you very much for the interesting panel, very interesting views. I have a question for you, Jinghua. You talked about offensive cyber operations, and I agree with you that we see indeed an increase in states that openly are going to be more offensive. I think the US is playing a leading role here with their precision engagement strategy. And I also agree with you that this increase in offensive cyber operations risks a cycle of escalation, of tit-for-tat actions. And in the end, if everyone is going to start offensive and preemptive cyber operations, it will be one big chaos in the cyber domain. The only problem is that even if you are against this increase of offensive cyber operations, that if you talk to policymakers in this field, they say, well, we don't like doing offensive cyber operations ourselves, but we do not see any alternatives anymore, because we tried for a long time to restrain ourselves to focus on defensive cyber operations, but they didn't work. The increase in cyber attacks is only continuing. So anything we tried on the defensive level, like diplomatic actions, legal procedures, sanctions, it didn't work. So my question to you is, if indeed we all agree that this increase in offensive cyber operations is not a good development, what alternatives can we offer to policymakers to stop the cyber attacks on the networks in our societies? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Jürgen Altmann, please.
Here, Jürgen Altmann, a physicist and peace researcher from Technical University in Dortmund in Germany. I have written a little on confidence-building measures for cyber armed forces, and I'm grateful to Giacomo for pointing out that sometimes the things that are not in the international documents are the important ones. So in particular, if one looks at the OSCE confidence-building measures, one finds that they start arguing there is a potential stability risk from state armed forces preparing cyber action, but then they don't tackle military aspects. It's all about civilian cooperation, exchange, and so on, while the OSCE itself has a very long tradition of working with armed forces. They do inspections with conventional forces. They look at new types, etc., etc. There's this Vienna document where all these actions take place. And why is it so difficult to transfer the experiences from inspections and information exchange about actual armed forces in the conventional field to the armed forces that prepare cyber operations? That is probably less a question to the OSCE person because he's under instructions from the member states. It's more a question to the member states, but nevertheless, maybe you have some idea on that.
Thank you very much. Next one is Johannes Slobodka.
Yes, Hannes Svoboda from Vienna International Institute for Peace. My question is to Raluca concerning the artificial intelligence. Maybe you can deal a bit with the red lines you discussed. In medicine, there's research done with some strange results. I don't like personally, but it seems that sometimes the algorithm gives a better diagnosis than the doctors, the men or women doctors. So is similar research done concerning the weapons that maybe in some cases artificial intelligence could prevent some attacks where human may come to a wrong judgment? So could you a bit elaborate on that, where the red lines you think will go, in what direction will it go, or should it go? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Next one on the list, Tarek Rauf.
It's me over here. Thank you. Tarek Rauf, formerly with the IAEA. I had a question for Giacomo and also for Ms. Liu. Giacomo, I was wondering whether you could say something about safety and security of nuclear weapons and nuclear power plants from cyber attacks. It's reported that there have been at least 15 plus incidents involving IT in nuclear power plants, some of them malicious and some of them not. But one of the big fears these days is cyber attacks on command and control facilities, on safety and security of nuclear weapons. And from your presentation, it seemed that the General Assembly's group of governmental experts were not dealing with those issues, but others, but whether you had any views yourself. And to Ms. Liu, in your presentation, you mentioned about the cyber attacks on Iran's enrichment program, and while your slide was correct that the monthly production of enriched uranium did not decline, but nonetheless, Iran did suffer the loss of a few thousand centrifuges as a result. You also talked a little bit about the US's cyber capabilities, but I wanted to also bring up China's offensive cyber operations. It's reported in many US publications that the PLA has successfully managed to acquire design information on all 15 operational nuclear warhead types in the US arsenal, on 5th generation air superiority fighters, on hypersonic boost glide vehicles. So in the field, it seems China is not lacking behind, and the US is also now very publicly warning about Western countries acquiring Huawei technology for 5th generation networks. So where would you put China in this spectrum of offensive or defensive cyber operations? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Next one is Rein Didekivi.
Thank you. Rein Didekivi from International Center for Defense Studies, Tallinn. I have a question. What kind of steps should to do? I mean, in UN, in among the states to speed up relatively slow progress in the issue of how international law should apply to cyberspace. As we well know, there are no consensus in existing international law is applicable or not. And as we know, among the Western countries is a pretty common approach, wide consensus that international law is applicable, but there are the states still which are not, which are in opposition in this discussion. And the gray area here is expanding day by day, and this allows to some countries to introduce a new and not very justified restriction on internet freedom. And I don't mention even that this uncertainty operating outside of international law is a good environment for the cross-border criminal crimes. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Next one on the list, Dania Dorsikova.
Thank you. I was hoping you could speak a little bit more about malicious cyber operations just short of these offensive cyber attacks, quote unquote, and talk a little bit more about how cyber can facilitate, or rather what international approaches can be used to address the use of cyber for other types of crime. So I'm thinking specifically in this instance of the use of cyber, including the abuse of cryptocurrencies for sanctions evasion activities. I know there's been a little bit of an effort from the FATF, for instance, the Financial Action Task Force, to try to address, again, the use of cyber for those kinds of criminal activities. I was wondering if you've seen any other best practices or have given any thought to what kind of efforts at the international level can be taken to address that use of cyber.
Thank you. It has been common to have only one round of questions and give the panelists the chance to answer. So I will just allow 3 other questions which are on my list. And unfortunately, we have to postpone all other questions to either the coffee break or another panel. So next one would be Imad Mito.
Thank you so much. This is a very interesting topic. My questions. The role of private sector in terms of their ability for servers, ISP, for research and development, for the collaboration with governments. How is the role of the private sector introduced into your paradigm? Secondly, the role of non-state actors in terms of hackers for hire, the issue of the question of accountability, finding the source of the initial attack, false flag operations. How do we account for that, and how do we go around it? Finally, thinking about binding international legal instruments for, for controlling cyber weapons use or infiltration. Has there been any thought about how can that be somehow added into already instruments within WMD conventions as an additional component to bring it up to date with the realities on the ground? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Next one, Thea Riebe, please.
Thank you very much. My name is Thea Riebe. I'm from Technical University of Darmstadt, from the Computer Science Department, where we focus on cybersecurity. And my question goes into the question of risk assessment of cyber operations, because we've seen many states engaging in cyber operations, and we also know that the infrastructure is shared, or that we have a similar infrastructure in the civilian and in the military area concerning software and hardware. And when we talk about cyber operations, I miss that we talk about risk assessment, actually, because once exploits are used and become public, it's very hard to control how they spread even among non-state actors, and how they can be controlled, actually, as we have seen, for example, with WannaCry, who was something that has been found by the NSA and later used by criminal groups. So I would be very interested to hear something about common efforts on risk assessment, something like an international or common vulnerability equity process. Yeah, I would be very curious to hear about that. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Last one on the list, Ali Ashka Zoltanian.
Thank you very much. The cyber attack against nuclear facilities has a radiological consequence. This is different from any other cyber attack. Therefore, we have to put it in the context of nuclear security. And when we do so, we have to have the approach taking into consideration the conventions, resolutions related to nuclear security. And I think that we have not highlighted, we don't see highlighting this concern. Of course, in this good presentation was mentioning the cyber attack, Stuxnet against enrichment in Iran, and there have been other cases, of course. But we have to highlight, I hope, in these kind of gatherings or reflection to other documents and officials that this needs a special attention. And therefore, how to put it, it is a nuclear security concern. And the resolution that I raised in the previous session, 533, when I worked in 1990, rather than putting the military attack at that time, 30 years ago, we put the title of that resolution, which is talking about arms attacks, so that it will also, that resolution, cover this cyber attack. Therefore, Resolution 533 of 1990 covers armed attack against nuclear facilities. Even threat of attack is violation of UN Charter and international law. This is just food for thought, and all of us should work in that direction. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I myself would just like to throw one last question to you, which you might or might not want to answer. In how far can we differentiate between offense and defense in the cyber realm? As far as I understand it, if you just want to be defensive, you need to have penetrated the opponent's system before. So is it actually possible to come to some kind of differentiation here? So now I would like to give back to the panel. I would say we start on my left-hand side with Gregor. And every one of you has approximately up to 5 minutes. Thank you.
Okay, I will try to do this as quick as possible. The first question on protecting people, why it may seem that states only negotiate, in our case, confidence-building measures that protect them. If you remember, I talked about the 3 dimensions of OSCE's approach to security, the third one being the human dimension, and this is constantly on the table and is integrated into CBMs as such. At the same time, we have international law norms that are in place and do apply to cyber as well, like the protection of human rights. And for CBM specifically, I would like to give you the example of CBM4. OSCE CBM4, which is information exchanges to ensure the open, interoperable, secure, and reliable internet. So this is very much focused on the people. But if you're talking about practical measures like awareness-raising campaigns, these are also in the realm of the OSCE's work, especially through our missions. We do often run awareness-raising campaigns on how to be safe on the internet, or at least facilitate the national awareness-raising campaigns of this sort. Regarding the question on why we do not take lessons learned from military inspections and relate that to cyber, this is a sensitive question. I agree, you're very right there. There are some CBMs that do address that issue. For example, CBMs 3 hold consultation to prevent political and military intentions, but this is not, I think, what you were talking about. If I allow myself to speak freely for just a moment, I think when we talk about cyber, it's a little bit of a different playing field, because there is a fear that disclosing your cyber arsenal might quickly make it, you lose the advantage. Because in cyber, it's very easy to copy certain capabilities. It's much more difficult to copy a tank it's easier to copy a program. So I think there is a little bit of hesitance, and this is also seen in the vulnerability disclosure, which is something that we focus on quite a lot. It's the same story. So before you share, you have to really focus on building trust, building relationships. And this is exactly why we focus on CBM so much, and we keep saying we are there to facilitate trust building, communication, and awareness raising. This is the foundation upon which you can share more information. There was a question on the role of the private sector in cyber. The private sector has a huge role in ensuring that the cyberspace is secure. There are some obstacles between public and private corporations, but what we do is try to facilitate agreements between the public and the private sector in order to, again, facilitate information sharing. And lastly, the question on differentiation between the offensive and defensive cyber incidents or operations, as you put it. This is indeed very difficult. As you know, attribution in cyber is a very tricky subject. We have different types of attribution, technical being the most straightforward, but then it gets a little bit complicated when we start talking about political attribution. There are, as was mentioned, false flag operations. You can have IPs coming from one country that are used as a proxy. So it's much more difficult to talk about whether an operation was actually offensive, defensive. First, we need to establish how do we tackle attribution. I think this is the main key. Okay.
Thank you very much for the questions. Including the dimension of red lines, which is an ongoing interest for me and still an open question. For sure, the most important red line is actually humans need to have the ultimate decision of life and death. So that would be, for me, the ultimate red line. So delegating life and death decisions to machines crosses that line. Now, in terms of the development of autonomous weapon systems, AI-enabled weapon systems, I think the way to go about in terms of norm entrepreneurship is to stigmatize the development. I know that the ban of these technologies at this point is still under discussion in certain other fora, such as the campaign to stop killer robots for that matter. But I think that engendering a wider debate, critical debate, both in the international arena, EU, citizens as well, in general, civil society and academia, in terms of stigmatizing the development of these technologies is one way to go about it. Other elements and red lines, concerning the technology, more about the technological robustness when we develop them, the way we can trace certain decisions that our algorithms make. So here, the predictability of these technologies when we deploy them. I think that these questions need to be taken into account, as well as developing, for example, in critical areas like the military, common ethical and lawful approaches for the AI's deployment in the theaters of war, and also thinking about the dimension of human-machine interaction and teaming and the potential ethical and decision-making challenges that this brings. So all these dimensions, I think that, well, even though maybe red lines is a buzzword that I used before, but these are definitely dimensions that need to be addressed when we think about AI applications in the defense area. Now, concerning the question about the private sector and especially the AI, and this is something that is quite an important development as well when we see about when we see innovation in this field, because previously we had spin-offs effects of research and development more from the military. Even the internet age that we are enjoying now comes from this, these developments. But with AI, we see an important impact of big tech that actually have the innovation potential, and then the questions of governments and as well as militaries is trying to spin in this innovation happening more in the civilian and private sector. And I think that addressing that as well is very important in a broader sense, and also the social and political impact of how these new exciting applications that have positive effects, like, for example, healthcare, you mentioned that, then are being captured, let's say, by the defense industry or defense and governments in general. I think that, yeah, that was it on my side.
Thank you. You?
About the questions I've got, I start from the first one, who is asking about how to protect people rather than only from the nation state, and what China has done in that area. So when we talk about cybersecurity, is a very broad concept. At least it can be classified into 3 areas. The first is a hard security, like the security of the software and hardware used by the government and the militaries. The second is about the economy, how to make sure that the internet are accessible to the to be used by the companies to enhance the economic development. And the third is about social questions, like the privacy that has been talked very often in Europe, and also like social stability that are being talked about very often in China, and like how to prevent any terrorism by the usage of internet. So in those areas, China has been publishing laws on how to provide a accessible, peaceful, and stable and open internet to make sure that people can benefit from the economic development, and second, to make sure that the social stability can be maintained to let people live in a better or stable situation. And about hard security, we have published the cyber security law to make sure that the supply chain is safe, to make sure that the hardware can be protected from cyber attacks. And also there are other laws that are being discussed very often, like the cyber criminal laws. We have cyber criminal courts that are dealing with all the criminal cases that are happening in China. About the second question, I think that is a very often mentioned argument that the failure of previous defense has led to the US to take a much more proactive way to defend the country. So if the offensive is very escalatory, what we can do? First of all, I still think we don't have to give up our efforts on the establishment of norms and rules that can be followed by most of the actors. And that is to provide or create a healthy cyber engine for the world, to share information, to make sure that non-state actors have less access to hacking tools to be used. Because most of the black market or the most harmful large-scale cyber operations taken by non-state actors we can see from till today are using the cyber tools that are being developed by the national states, by the nation states. So first of all, the countries have to work together to think about what the norms we can build and what kind of healthy cyber environment we can provide. And the second, is I'm not just saying cyber offense is always not usable, but we have to establish more clearer threshold about when you want to use it and what kind of targets, punishment you want to impose to make sure that all the threshold can be clearly understood by most states to avoid miscalculations. And there are also and third, I think it's also very important to enhance defense capabilities by your own. In cyberspace, we know that attack is much easier, but another feature of cyberspace is much easier to resilient, much easier to build the backup redundancies. Even though you are attacked today, it's much easier to resume the other day. So we can think of retaliate, but also we can do more to enhance your defense capabilities by capacity building measures. And also the fourth solution is about CBM, like how to share information, how to communicate with bigger countries, to make sure to be more transparent about the cyber policies and the cyber arms to avoid all the unnecessary escalation. The third, this is the second question. The third question is about what's China's role in the offensive cyber operation. Third, you have mentioned are, I have to say there are a very clear difference between cyber military operations and cyber espionage. So and cyber IP theft. So if we read all the official documents produced by the US, when they mention Russia, mention China, and mention Iran and North Korea, they are using different descriptions. And most of the concerns regarding China is IP theft and espionage. So these are not offensive operations. And that's the first claim I have to make. The second is China is, till today, I haven't seen China in any reported offensive operations that the PLA is taking a big role. All of the stories we've heard, I'm not saying here I don't have the right or the knowledge to say it's right or it's wrong, but all the stories we've heard is about espionage, not cyber operations. And China has made it clear that even though today the cyber arms race is already underway, we can still step back and think, do we just accept the status quo and make the new domain into a space for arms race? Or we can still think what we can do together to make it to be used in a more peaceful way. Oh, sorry, 1 minute. So let me see.
Just pick and choose one.
Okay, I will choose. Hard to choose. So I want to talk a little bit about the nuclear cyber risk. I came from Carnegie, and our cyber policy initiative are now in the process of producing a report on how to make sure that there will be no nuclear disasters or conflicts caused by the unintended the cyber operations in NC3 system. The basic scenario or the basic assumption is there are only very few country states or actors that have the capability to target the NC3 because it's a core part of the nuclear facility. And the second scenario is the key actors that have the capability don't have the intention to get involved or start a nuclear war between themselves. As the third assumption is that it can only be caused by misunderstandings or miscalculations. So we have to work on what are the miscalculations, like the third-party factors, like what the difference between cyber espionage and the cyber activities, and where are the three core parts that even cyber espionage is not a good idea to think of. So I will stop here.
Just pick and choose what to do.
Thank you. So conscious of the time, I'm just going to answer one question because I've been given 1.5 minutes. So in particular, I'd like to reflect on the question that asked about what can we do? What steps can we take to speed up the progress of achieving some sort of consensus over how does international law apply in cyber? Well, I just want to say that the next 1.5 years are by design an opportunity to do so. I just counted on the calendar, there will be, over the next 18 months, there will be 8 multilateral meetings between the open-ended working group and the group of governmental experts, both of which will have to discuss or will be having the opportunity to discuss this issue. So there is, one answer is that there will be more opportunities over the next 18 months to tackle some of these issues, and in particular within the group of governmental experts, what that group is being asked to produce is not only a consensus report at the end of it, but also the report should include annexes with national contributions on how international law applies to cyberspace. Now, the first step to resolve any differences is understanding what the differences are. So hopefully through the combination of these two multi-stakeholder processes happening in parallel over the next 18 to 24 months, and a clear picture about what do member states perceive at the national level to be the applicability of international law to cyber, we'll be able to advance this envelope forward. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Giacomo, for pointing out that the next 2 years will be so important, because that will help us to have another panel on the issue next year, so where we can continue debating so many issues which have not been addressed. We haven't talked about the EU's cybersecurity strategy, the EU Cybersecurity Act. So definitely we will have another panel on cyber. But before we think ahead, please join me in thanking all our panelists who have done a great job, some under very special conditions.